Okay, welcome everybody to English 212. Hope everyone's keeping warm. Sorry that we could not meet. I'm sure you're sorry as well. So today, basically, this is going to be the lecture that we would have had for pages 36 through 106 of Brave New World. So taking a look at the schedule, we are talking about Brave New World, pages 36 through 106, which is all the way through chapter 6. And then for next time, you need to be able to have read pages 107 through 145. In fact, let me double check and see if that ends on a chapter or what the last words are for those of you who are using a different edition. Read all the way through chapter 9 is what I expect for Thursday. So please make sure that you do keep up with the reading and that you do that. And if you haven't, done the reading for this time, you need to catch up. So I'm going to try to do this as best as I can and hopefully get done in about an hour is my aim. This is not a usual format, but I think we can make it work. There are times where I might ask you to pause the video so you can take a look at some of the media that I had to incorporate into today's lesson. And before we begin about talking about Brave New World, and I'm actually really kind of bummed because I usually like talking to you guys to get some ideas for my lecture as I'm going, rather than just giving it straight to you because I like the discussion. But no worries, we'll make do with what we have. I do want to list about 10 major ideas or themes that I was going to incorporate into today's discussion. I think are very important because there's a lot going on with these pages, and if you're feeling lost, that's okay. Don't get too lost because then you'll get lost for the rest of the course. And if that is the case, be sure to contact me if any plot details are confusing, because this is somewhat very similar to science fiction, where it gets disorienting because it's so different. It's not something that we're really used to, seeing how a society operates. In fact, the society itself is more of a character than the individual characters in it, because of how much it takes prominence in a utopian or dystopian narrative, so to speak. But 10 major ideas. One thing that we get right away is the history, the prehistory to the world state and why the world state came about. So I think that is very worthwhile to take note of, especially for something like a midterm. I think there are various things in here that I could pull for a midterm that I think are important to the themes that we might consider dystopian. Other things that come out of this is the social programming. There's a lot of maxims that are said, like everyone belongs to everyone else, that, like anytime a question to the way things are, especially from Bernard, you might see someone like Lenina make these little offhand quips, like ending is better than mending, where it kind of shows that how deep in root the social programming has is ingrained in the citizens of the world state, to where it makes them pretty much unconscious. And as Bernard says, they're basically like infants. So that's something that I'm gonna social programming, class prejudices. We see all those coming up now, all as a result from the hypnopaedia, and just the molding into a specific class, such as alpha or beta or epsilon or gamma or delta, all of them. And we also see that they're, despite trying to be a utopia, which a world state really is presented as a utopia. In fact, a lot of times this is called utopian satire because it's presented as if it's supposed to be for the better. But there are still a lot of flaws that we'll take note of as we go. Number 3 is kind of the lingering individualism, which comes through mostly through Bernard and Helmholtz Watson. Bernard being kind of an inferior alpha, who sulks as a result of it and wishes he wasn't so inferior, and yet still rebels out of spite against people like the director and Lenina and people like that. While you have Helmholtz Watson, who's on the polar opposite end, who is, an alpha, like beyond alpha, to the point that he's too able, that he's exceeding what is normal for an alpha. Like, they say one of the part of the motto is stability, and you can't have stability if others are exceeding if individuals within a particular class are going beyond what the majority is. because then you have difference, and that becomes problematic for something like a utopia, because there needs to be more sameness to keep stability and to not have things like envy and jealousy, which Bernard certainly does. Also in the world state, the technology is very important. Just the day-to-day technology, like the crematorium, for instance, the various bureaus, things that they have, and everyone basically has a personal helicopter in world state. That's not too bad. You get to fly as an alpha. You get to fly around your own personal helicopter. Although that's not really too different from today. I imagine with corporations have private jets that they can just take wherever they want. Sounds like fun. So technology is number 4. Number 5, sexual behavior in general. In fact, sexuality is kind of expressed in the world state through rituals at one point. In fact, a sexual ritual an orgy basically seems to kind of replace a kind of communion basically that we see in Christianity. That it's almost like appropriating Christianity for the purposes of the world state to keep everyone pacified. So yeah. We'll take a look at number 6. We'll take a look at Bernard as an individual, because most times when I ask my classes what they think of Bernard, they're usually very sympathetic, and I want to try to dispel that notion that we should really give 2 shits about Bernard, because he's not very sympathetic at all. He's actually a very envious, very shallow individual. But we understand his shallowness. In fact, you can almost sympathize with his shallowness because of what his social life is like. Let's see. Number 7 is religion, which kind of ties into sexual behavior, or just the replacement of Ford with religion. Number 8, the reservation. The Savage Reservation becomes very important, and we've seen a little bit of it at this point. Number 9, talk about Soma, the role of Soma a little bit, which is basically a drug that just makes you happy. If you ever feel anything bad, well, a gram is better than a dam, is what they say in the book, and that is something to take of note. Especially, I noticed one student talked about Serenity and talked about the drug there, and it's almost, the aims are very similar, even though the results of Soma are actually successful, as opposed to Pax and Serenity, as the student described it, not so successful. And then 10 is discontent. So, I'm doing these in order way I think are most important. We might not get to all of them. But those are things to keep in mind. So when we left off, we're still with the World Controller, and the World Controller was talking to the students about the history of how the world state came to be. In this section, a lot of times might be somewhat confusing because it's fragments of different scenarios, different situations. Like when there's a space in the paragraph, it might go from the World Controller to Lenina in the locker room, to Bernard in the locker room, back to the World Controller, and it switches around in that way. So it's kind of it's a nice little good old merry-go-round kind of thing as far as scenes and scenarios. So it's not linear. Well, it's not completely linear in the sense that we break from one scene to the other. But one thing I do want to focus on is on the World Controller's discussion of the world state, because one of the things that happens there is that we get a sense as to why the old world, the world that we're more familiar with, the world that probably speaks to us more, didn't work. Because in a sense, we grew out of the world that the world state eventually just rejects because of its wars and its instability and things like that. In fact, let's see. In fact, building on what we talked about last time, one of the things that happens, for example, on page 37, is that they get sick of just hearing about families. On 37, it says, home, this is the World Controller talking, home, a few small rooms, stifling, over-inhabited by a man, by a periodically teeming woman, by a rabble of boys and girls of all ages. No air, no space, an under-sterilized prison, darkness, disease, and smells. The controller's evocation was so vivid that one of the boys, more sensitive than the rest, turned pale at the mere description. It was on the point of being sick. So, family and home is basically dirty words here. Like, those things are laughable to the world state. They see it as, families are seen as unstable and not healthy to the state. But in political terms, though, the family in some ways is also considered the microcosm of the state. So if you have an unstable family, you can't have a stable state, which means you have to get rid of the family, and that's what the world state has done. There's no need for a family when there's no mother or father in this world, and that's what's supposed to be so different. Is that these are test tube babies. They basically surgically remove ovaries and then grow, and then artificially produce human beings for their own purposes. No need for a mother or father, especially when everyone belongs to everyone else. Because one of the things that the World Controller touches on is how sick it was that a mother would call their child their own, and things, and as we see here, everyone belongs to everyone else. Just the very even insinuation that you're somewhat monogamous here is frowned upon. I mean, if we think of Fanny Crown, for instance, the friend of Lenina on page 40, she basically chastises Lenina for going out with Henry Foster for a couple months without having anyone else. In fact, here, everything's about consumption, right? About the consumerism, where if it doesn't promote consumerism, even in the relationships between the citizens, then it's not good for the world state. People are to be consumed. You have her, which is what and you see Bernard kind of lamenting that, like he sees that the men think of Lenina as meat or as mutton, but that's the nature of sex here, and they're all in agreement about that they just have each other. They're just you have flavors of the week basically, and then you move on and you try a different flavor. But you don't stick with just one flavor. That's just strange and awkward and not healthy in the world state. In fact, I think one of the flaws and one of the more ridiculous aspects of that dynamic, on page 45. You get to see how sex is a consumption activity, where the World Controller, asks a question to the students, and he says, "Has any of you ever encountered an insurmountable obstacle?" And one of the students asked, once, and in response said, "I once had to wait nearly 4 weeks before a girl I wanted would let me have her." Oh. Which, and they all laugh at it because it seems so horrible, so torturous that you have to wait a couple weeks to have, to be able to just go in and have sex with some girl that you desired, because, in this society, the girls and the men are both products. They're, they're walking on the streets, you might as well just see them on shelves, basically, for the taking. And it's an open society to the extent that everyone does belong to everyone else, and that if you want somebody, you can have them. There's no qualms about feeling frustrated. There's not supposed to be. They're trying to eradicate frustration in general for any wish, for any desire, sexual desire especially. They're trying to eradicate that and get rid of it, which is part of the utopian thing, is that utopias, as I've said before, negatively get rid of what they see as a sickness. And they see personal frustration they see as a sickness. And so to facilitate that, they make it things more easily accessible for people, which is in direct contrast to the past. In fact, even Fanny says to Lenina that she should try and make an effort to be promiscuous, to fit in with everyone else and maintain the stability. So she continues to help and not create discontent. Other things that we see about the past in the past contrasted with the present. On page 46 is where we start to get into it a little bit. Let's see. Where it talks about there's a paragraph that talks about the resistance to the new form of generating new people. In fact, he says there was something called Christianity. Women were forced to go on being viviparous. Viviparous is what I meant to say. Viviparous, which basically means that you have to conceive a child naturally. A man plants a seed, takes, plants a seed in the womb of a woman, and the fetus grows in the womb of a woman, and then you give a natural birth. This is just a general definition of that. And here, as we see, Christianity has pretty much been eradicated and removed from the world state. It doesn't exist anymore. It's been it does exist because it's been appropriated, as we'll see with the. Let me see what it's called. As we'll see with the frenzy of greater beings, greater beings coming. What is that called? Solidarity groups. That might be something to take note of. Solidarity group. Solidarity. So that might be something for the midterm to take note of. Solidarity group is basically where they get together and have their communal song, 12 in 1, that they're coming together. They're all separate individuals, but they can come together and unify as one. In this case, it takes place in an orgy. Yeah. But back then they say that there was something called democracy, where everyone could have a voice. And a common trope that we'll see, a common motif that we'll see in these dystopian works that we read, is that these dystopias, or utopias, however you want to see them, it's hard to tell what they really are born from war. They're usually a catastrophic war that basically causes so much havoc and so much damage that you have to rebuild. And in this case, they rebuild what might seem to us a nightmare. In fact, if you look at the 9 Years' War description on page, on page 47, they talk about the nature of the war, and a lot of mention, and you see a list there of some chemicals like phosogene, chloropicrin, ethyl iodocetate, things that are really hard to pronounce, and basically it all ties in. These are chemical weapons that the World Controller is listing off that were used during the war. Hydrocyanic acid, for example, kills people in 10 minutes. If you're curious about that. So, prior to this kind of new utopian world where everyone is happy now, as Henry Foster says, you had all this misery, all this war. So it almost kind of makes sense that the world state kind of came out of that, because it's horrific, it's horrible. And Huxley writing during this time, it's, I think, a little bit over a decade since the World War I ended, but that still lingers in the memory. In fact, one of the things that the World Controller says is that liberty and freedom are inefficient in this world, which, as Americans, we usually kind of value that. So that's one of the ways that this can in Western in the tradition of Western civilization, we kind of value things like liberty and freedom, and so to have that taken away from us for the greater good is something that's kind of seen as undesirable, at least from our point of view. Here, it's been completely accepted because they've been conditioned to accept it, as Bernard kind of shows us. Okay, I mean, there was also a great economic collapse after the 9 Years' War. There was a great economic collapse, and then there was a choice between world control and destruction, and they chose world control. Other things that get erased from the past, for instance, they don't remember Shakespeare. Let's see. It says also that every man, woman, and this is on page 49, every man, woman, and child compelled to consume so much a year in the interest of industry, the sole result. I know at one point, what I have in mind that I'm not seeing here is that there was basically an elimination of opposition. There were people in the past who opposed the development of the world state, and they were just eliminated, basically. Um, I don't have that in front of me at the moment, unfortunately. Oh, but there is on page 51. There was a campaign against the past. They closed museums. They blew up historical monuments, things like that. And there was the suppression of all books published before after Ford 150. Because again, taking away the education is one way to ensure that people remain stupid and dumb and have no thoughts of rebellion. So they'll go with what their assigned position is. So yeah, those are some of the things that they got rid of. And what do they have to maintain? People maintain this state of mind. People from thinking and challenging this new status quo that's developed in the world state. The answer is soma. In fact, I love the quote on page 54 where it says, "All the advantages of Christianity and alcohol, none of their defects." You take soma, like, no matter how shitty you feel, no matter how depressed, you take 1 gram of soma, it's the best antidepressant ever, basically. At least in this world. Here it's a fictional drug, but there is actually a drug on the market called soma. I can't remember off the top of my head what it does, but I think it's similar to kind of an antidepressant. And here, we even see Bernard, poor Bernard, who hates soma. He doesn't want to take it. Even when he takes it, he ends up feeling a little bit better. He's drugged. He's, in a sense, drugged to the point that he's not conscious of his thinking processes, which especially to intellectuals, that's very scary. We like to be aware of what we're doing generally, because otherwise you'll be you're just a puppet or a tool of the society that you're a part of. So yeah, Bernard really strives for individuality, which is one of his redeeming features, but he's also a very flawed character, as we'll see. We'll get there, especially when we talk about his date, his relationship with Helmholtz and his date with Lenina. Okay. Page 55 also. And part of the thing is to always part of the consumer culture of the world state is to always have distractions. If you notice, like after work, Lenina and Henry Foster, they go play things like obstacle golf or squash or some kind of special form of tennis that basically always keep them active, always keep them occupied and distracted. So or like when she goes with Bernard on the date, and he takes her out like over the ocean where the waves are coming in with the night, and almost beautiful, kind of majestic, natural scene, something in nature. She turns on the radio because she can't bear it, because they've already been conditioned not to like nature, and so they need the distraction. In which causes consumption. In fact, on page 55 at the bottom it says, "Now, such is progress." This is the world controller, by the way. The old men work, the old men copulate, the old men have no time, no leisure from pleasure, not a moment to sit down and think. Or if ever by some unlucky chance such a crevice of time should yawn in the solid substance of their distractions, there is always soma, delicious soma, half a gram for a half holiday, a gram for a week to end, a gram for a weekend, 2 grams for a trip to the gorgeous East, and it goes on in that manner. Gram is better than a damn. So there's no time for religion, for thinking, for none of that. There's no time for reflection, basically, which is what makes this, a dystopia. It's not an idiocracy per se, as we'll see clips from that film later on in the semester, but it's on par with that to a degree. And after all this more kind of background of the world, first at the beginning of the novel, we saw the world state. We were given a tour basically of how it develops, and then we're given a description of its history and its past, how it came into being, and then we're given a view of the world state from the eyes of particular characters such as Lenina, and Bernard and Marx, and even Helmholtz Watson, which is very interesting to see, because we get to see their subjective view of this new world that they're in. For example, Lenina is very popular, very pneumatic, which is one way of just saying that she's very curvy, very well, very busty, very, nice curvy hips, things like that, that are usually more sexually desirous in a female, physically speaking. But even she, and she's slept with pretty much most of the men that there are in the alpha class, which is interesting because promiscuity is not discouraged here. If this happened in our society, she would pretty much automatically be labeled a whore, which I don't know if that's Huxley's perspective or not. But here, she's doing what's socially expected of her. But even she notes some of the negative features. There's still, despite the genetic engineering, there's still flaws in what's engineered. For example, she talks about Benito Hoover and says how, without his clothes, how too hairy he is. There's still this individual preference still prevent, even if it's just in thought, it's still there undermining this goals of stability and things like that, of identity. Because Bernard will fixate on Morgana Rothschild is unibrow, basically her eyebrows, how bushy they are. They're still finding physical flaws in all of this. Another thing that's interesting, you also get little snippets of the lower classes. There's a epsilon minus semi-moron, is what the text says on page 58 to 59, which is one of my favorite parts of the books, actually, because I think it's so sad. He's basically the liftman. He's taking them to the roof to where their helicopters are, and when they get there, it says on page 59, at the very top, the warm glory of the afternoon sunlight made him start and blink his eyes. "Oh, Ruth," he repeated in a voice of rapture. He was as though suddenly and joyfully awakened from a dark, annihilating stupor. Ruth! He's taking in basically it looks like to me he's taking in the nice sunlight of the afternoon. He smiled up with a kind of doggedly expectant adoration into the faces of his passengers. He's very excited. He's not very bright, but he's excited. Talking and laughing together, they stepped out into the light. The liftman looked after them. "Ruth?" he said once more, questioningly. Then a bell rang, and from a ceiling of the lift, a loudspeaker began, very softly and yet very imperiously, to issue its commands. "Go down," it said. "Go down, floor 18. Go down, floor 18. Go down, go." The liftman slammed the gates, touched a button, and instantly dropped back into the droning twilight of the twilight of his own habitual stupor. It's one of my favorite parts, not only because of his excitement, but it's just it's so depressing because he's being sent below, and it's kind of almost symbolic of the fact of how he's being kept down in his place. He looks like that look of excitement and expectation is kind of is generally his wish to be more than what he is, to go, be that individual that Bernard Marx wished he was, and yet his commands are to go down. And in a dystopia, you're basically, citizens like an epsilon here in this world are going to be kept down. So yeah, and you have that echoed also in. Bernard looks at the sky too, and he says, "Isn't it beautiful?" And Lindenau says, "Simply perfect for obstacle golf." So it's very mundane, and very disconnected. He's admiring the beauty of nature, and she's like, "Yeah, good day for golf." And it's like, if you hear your parents telling you you're on your phones too much, it's kind of like that. If you see people walking around on their phones, it's kind of the similar concept that we're too distracted to take in the beauty of the everyday, of what nature has. For example, if you went to Colorado and the Rocky Mountains, I would really hope that you took a look around at the actual mountains themselves rather than spend the whole time on your phone. At least I know I would. Having been to the Rocky Mountains, I know I would take a look and gaze around at the mountains and enjoy the natural beauty of it. But yeah, not to say that technology is bad. Look, I'm using a camera right now to record my lecture. Moderation, folks, moderation. Okay. Now, other things to know about Bernard, because this is where Bernard starts to show up a little bit. And why Bernard's such a flawed character. Well, one, he's not recognized as an alpha. If you take a look on page 64, for instance, poor Bernard. he's a little too short. He's a little too short compared to the normal alpha, and so he actually like when he calls for servants from the lower classes to get his helicopter, he has trouble getting their attention because they don't think he's an alpha. In fact, on page 65, I'll go back to 64. But on page 65 it says let's see. Well, bottom of 64 onto 65. Each time he found himself looking on the level instead of downward into a Delta's face, he felt humiliated. Would the creature treat him with the respect due to his caste? The question haunted him, not without reason, for gammas, deltas, and epsilons had been, to some extent, conditioned to associate corporeal mass with social superiority. Excuse me. Indeed, a faint hypnopathic prejudice in favor of size was universal. So basically, they are sleep conditioned. You know, while they're sleeping, they're told that size matters as far as caste is concerned. Poor Bernard, maybe he had that too much alcohol in his blood circuit. May have stunted his growth. And so he doesn't look like an alpha, and he really resents that fact. In fact, one of the most petty things about Bernard is that if he looked normal, he would probably behave normal. There would probably be no sign of him being a pariah, so to speak. Being outsider to his caste or to the world state itself, because he's envious, and we see that especially with Helmholtz. Or, for example, on page 64, there's a part where he says, there's a part where he says, I am I, and I wish I wasn't. Because he wants to be an alpha. He wishes he was a normal alpha. And with Helmholtz, you kind of see that, because Bernard is very self-conscious of his inferiority to his caste. For example, Helmholtz, who's the man, he's a man's man. He's just... a Hercules among men, basically, is the general idea. And on page 68, the women are hounding Helmholtz as he's getting into Bernard's helicopter, and he keeps telling these women, no, my God, no, I'm busy, leave me alone. And they just keep pestering, because, he's Helmholtz Watson, oh my God, he's Helmholtz Watson. And, he says, these women, he said, as the machine rose into the air, these women, and he shook his head and he frowned. And then Bernard responds, too awful. Bernard hypocritically agreed, wishing as he spoke the words that he could have as many girls as Helmholtz did, and with as little trouble. So he only wishes he could have the conquest that Helmholtz has. But of course, Bernard is odd and weird and made fun of by his own caste, that he can't fit into this society. It's part of the tragedy of Bernard, but he's the way he responds to it is kind of petty in itself, that he's becomes very kind of narcissistic. So be careful when sympathizing with Bernard. In fact, be careful with sympathizing with anyone in this story, at least so far. Helmholtz comes closest. If I were to identify with a character, it would be someone like Helmholtz. Not because the girls are wildly after me, but just because if you see him, you can see that he's kind of a poetic spirit. He writes for the Bureau of Propaganda. That's where he works in emotional engineering, which is already kind of shows how imposing this state is. And yet he wishes for something more, because what he writes, he says, is too simple, and he wants something more that captures more of the kind of essence of being, something more philosophical than what the world state allows for, because the world state doesn't allow for philosophy. Everyone's too busy with obstacle golf, and some can't remember what the name of the tennis thing is, but some weird form of tennis. In fact, when Lenina complains about the North Pole, she complains about the fact that there's not enough courts for them to play their games on, because they're not there to see the North Pole. Fuck the North Pole. No one cares about that. They'd rather play their games. Getting back to Lenina, because I've kind of harped on Bernard quite a bit, and Well, I understand his, you understand his position, but you also have to realize how kind of petty he is, and that actually comes into play later in the novel. But also, Lenina is also an interesting character in her own right, I think. In fact, you kind of get to see what happens to a world state citizen in motion within the world state through her eyes, because she is, she's kind of the model, your kind of average, normal, though popular world state citizen. Alpha, well, can't remember if she's alpha or beta. In any case, she's at the upper crust. But for example, on page 62, you kind of see, you see those learned prejudices that have been hammered into her brain while she's been sleeping as a kid. And isn't it just great the way that Bernard knows how many repetitions there are because he's a hypnopadia specialist. So he knows that all of this is kind of, it's just artificial bullshit that they're spewing. It's morality without any thought. So like, they just say these quips to stifle any, sense of dissatisfaction. There's no real, doesn't mean they understand what they're saying. For example, Lenina on page 62, we get to see the society in motion. I mean, we see a changing of shifts, and we see the different classes and what they're doing on a day-to-day. And this is as they're flying in their helicopter. Let's see. So she saw forests of centrifugal bumble puppy towers gleam between the trees near Shepherd's Bush. 2,000 beta minus mixed doubles were playing Ryman surface tennis. That's what it's called. A double row of escalator 5 courts line the main road from Notting Hill to Williston, and the Ealing Stadium, a Delta gymnastic display, and community sing was in progress. One thing to note that it's interesting because it does say that this is in London, so we do know we're in England. In fact, it's funny to me that they kept the names. I mean, they changed the names of some things, but they kept the names like London and Notting Hill, which are obviously English. So I wasn't too sure last time, but I am sure now that this is taking place in London. And then they will visit the United States later on when they go to the Savage Reservation. But right after that it says, "What a hideous color khaki is," remarked Lenina, voicing the hypnopatic prejudices of her caste. And let's see, later she says, "I'm glad I'm not a gammon." So you see those prejudices shining through with her. And I think even on, we get to see how a normal girl in the world state behaves through her. In fact, it's interesting because Henry Foster is the man she's seen is much more attuned, almost in the same way that Watson and Marx are, to some of the flaws with their society. Later on, especially when he talks about the crematorium and things like that, which is darkly humorous. It's very kind of darkly humorous because basically the bodies of the people are being recycled to be used to help the environment. Not too bad of an idea, but still pretty gruesome. In fact, they fly through the smoke of the crematorium people, and it's kind of. In fact, Lenina says she gets quite a rush for it, while Henry Foster is much more. He reflects on it much more than she ever would. Okay. Any questions so far? Everyone good? Yeah, if you're responding to that, you're talking to a screen, so you're silly. Let's see. Yeah, on page 73 is where I had in mind about the crematorium, where, let's see. In fact, you see the separation of the classes too, because the lower classes still have their separate barracks. In fact, we'll see the lower classes a little bit more later on in the story, and it would, if anything, it's always really good to be an alpha or beta. It really kind of is, because it's so they're so dehumanized. Good word to look up, by the way, dehumanization, because that's a lot of what takes place in a dystopia like this, or the other dystopias that we read, where they're, it's like putting machines away, basically. In fact, they're described as being ant-like. But other things. Page 73 talks about how they're transformed into gas. Henry explains it. He says, on their way up to the chimney, the gases go through 4 separate treatments. P2O5 used to go right out of circulation every time they cremated someone. Now they recover over 98% of it, more than a kilo and a half per adult corpse, which makes the best part of 400 tons of phosphorus every year from England alone. Fine to think we can go on being socially useful even after we're dead, making plants grow. So the whole idea is social utility, that we're useful to society one way or the other. And here, even in death, we're still useful to the greater good, basically, which is what I think Huxley is basically making fun of that here. Because, especially during Huxley's time, burial is the much more proper way to bury someone, especially in Christian tradition, to give them good respect. Okay. Let's see. On page 77, one thing that's also useful to know about the citizens of World State is even the upper crust, they're all very infantile. In fact, I think that is the aim of this society. I think I remember the World Controller mentioning it, is that you want kind of an infantile society because they're going to basically look for basic pleasures. They're not going to think hard about anything. Don't ask a World State citizen to do your calculus homework, for instance, because they're not going to be able to. And this is what kind of just irks someone like Bernard, as we'll see later on. But on page 77, it's the culmination of the music that in fact they're listening to synth and color organs. So not only do you have music, it's synthetic music is what it's called. So that might be something to take note of. The synthetic music, where you incorporate hearing both with sight and smell, basically. So it's a very very sensual experience. In fact, did you know that at one point in the movie theaters, they I can't remember when this was, but they tried to make a more sensory experience, like have certain smells at certain times of the movie, or certain vibrations in the chair, so that you would try to feel what's going on in the movie as if you were a part of it. And I think that's kind of the same sentiment here with the synthetic music. And when it culminates, basically, it says on page 77, the end of the first paragraph, and when exhausted, the 16 had laid by their saxophones, not saxophones, saxophones, and the synthetic music apparatus was producing the very latest and slow Malthusian blues. They might have been twin embryos gently rocking together on the waves of a bottled ocean of blood surrogate. In fact, there's a lot of mention about this kind of regressive, this regression back to your state in the bottle of, being a blood surrogate. It's something that's something to be desired, basically, to be that simple again, infant-like. If you ever come across a man who's 26 years old and still fantasizes about going back to breastfeeding, yeah, it's a little disturbing. But here it'd probably be something encouraged a little bit. Well, not here, because that's just gross, because there's no such thing as a mother. Anyways, that's a little different. But they're basically infantile. In fact, I think later, Bernard says to on page 94, Bernard says to Lenin something very important in that vein. He says on page 94, he says, adults intellectually and during working hours, he went on, infants where feeling and desire are concerned. And it's true. They're very, very simplistic. They don't, and part of that's the conditioning. I mean, when they're infants, when they're children, they're taught to engage in sexual games, so it becomes a norm for them. So, to deviate from that norm is to make yourself a danger to the society, which is part of the frightening thing, so that norms change. And norms change to the degree that, to deviate even slightly is somewhat seen as a danger, even in our own time. I mean, there's various deviations still, things that are taboo that will still make you kind of a pariah, either from family, from church, from coworkers, things like that. Things that you need, that some of us intentionally keep private because we don't want to be viewed in a certain way. And Bernard certainly kind of drawing that attention to him when he actually uses something so simple as just thought, which maybe we take for granted in our society, possibly. But in fact, talking about the effects of soma, which is also pretty interesting, it says that before we're going to bed with each other, they usually take soma to facilitate it, to get things going, because it makes you feel exuberant, it makes you feel good. And it says at the bottom, page 77, so only half an hour before closing time, the second dose of soma had raised quite an impenetrable wall between the actual universe and their minds. Almost kind of creating an alternate reality for them, an escape from reality, which is a lot of times what dystopias concern themselves with, at least especially dystopian commentary on today's generation, for instance. There's a lot of fear about us, with our technological advancements, for us to be disconnected with the reality that's out there, or what's going on. For instance, who knows if is the NSA watching me on my iPad? I don't know. Maybe I'm too distracted from doing this lecture. But they are, I'm sure they're having a hell of a time because I'm giving away so much information. Okay. The next thing I want to discuss is the solidarity group, because that's something to take note of. That I've had people write response papers on the solidarity group thing, which I think is great because it's such an interesting, scene, I think, as far as Brave New World is concerned. Where 12 people are to come into one, but you see how, if you imagine some of the pettiness of churchgoers today, I don't know, I'm not sure what denomination some of you might go to or have belonged to, or if you belong to any religion at all. Having grown up Southern Baptist, I was always subjected to the scrutinies, of church-going kind. Like, where was I sitting in the church? What was I wearing in the church? And I hate to be ageist, but that usually came from the old senior members of the church. They expected a certain decorum. And you're still going to have that pettiness here, especially with Bernard, when, he's worried about being last to show up to church. Well, to show up to the solidarity group, which is basically church in the world state. Page 79. And when he realizes that he's not last, he prepares to make a frowning face at the person who was, so to shame them, basically. And it's, basically sounds like it's church culture, basically. I mean, that's basically what a lot of churches do nowadays, is that they want to shame people for not doing, not being the pillar of the congregation. And it's all petty, it's all silly, it's all vain. But the ritual itself is, fairly interesting. I mean, the second coming now is not of Jesus Christ, being of the Christian religion that Mustafa Mann said that was eradicated, but instead it's Henry Ford, the great Fordness, basically. And let's see. And to become one of the things that they do is they take some ice cream. They have chants and songs, like on page 81 it says, "Ford, we are 12. Oh, make us one. Like drops within the social river. Oh, make us together run as swiftly as thy shining flivver." And a flivver is basically just a motor vehicle. That's the English word for a motor vehicle, basically. But yeah, the whole coming together is to come together as a social unit, talking more emphasis on the society than the individual. In fact, we see that in the words of Henry Foster as well, when he talks about, no, it's not Henry Foster, it's the director of the hatching center, the hatchery center, when he talks about losing his companion, and then just talking about it as if, that their cells to take the place of her within the social body. And in that sense, society becomes a metaphor. You have a body, and to lose a part doesn't necessarily kill the whole, which is what gets the emphasis here. But back with the solidarity service, it is kind of a ritual. It's, might be a strange ritual to us, but one of the things that is also brilliant about this in terms of keeping them repressed is the fact that there's a mob mentality behind the ritual. There's almost a frenzy, basically. Like, they all start saying things like they hear the feet of the greater being coming towards the door and things like that. And then Bernard, who doesn't want to say things like that, finds himself saying it too, so he doesn't feel left out. He doesn't want to be the last one to. On page 84, for instance, it says, feeling that it was time for him to do something, Bernard jumped up and shouted, "I hear him, he's coming!" But it wasn't true. He heard nothing, and for him nobody was coming. Nobody, in spite of the music, in spite of the morning excitement. But he waved his arms, he shouted with the best of them, and when the others began to jig and stamp and shuffle, he also jigged and shuffled. And it's basically a mob mentality. Like, you don't know what crowds are capable of until you get swept up in one. And it just happens that this crowd turns into an orgy, basically. In fact, it says orgy porgy, Ford and fun, kiss the girls, and that's basically how this ritual ends. It's supposedly a wonderful experience for all of them. Okay. In chapter 6, the last chapter of our discussion, this is where we have kind of the date between Bernard and Lenina, which is, I think, it's important to see the differences between them. She's willing to do this because she wants to do something different, because, she's pretty much slept with every other guy anyways. And she doesn't want to go back to the North Pole. But Bernard is nasty. He even says he would rather be himself and nasty than not himself. And he feels like he's not himself. There's that sense of loss of individuality that he doesn't want to have when he takes Soma. Like, to take Soma is to lose yourself into the social body. And he kind of values himself as an individual. In fact, we see that later when he, sees himself as a rebel against the director, because the director has to threaten him. And, he's such a... And then Bernard, very pridefully sees that as a triumph for whatever reason. But Bernard is kind of our classic romantic person, not in the sense of individualism. I'm talking about the artistic movement rather than just romantic with Lenina. He doesn't bring her flowers or anything like that. He wants to experience life in some of the most profoundest ways according to what his mind is capable of. But this isn't the place to do it. It's not the society to do it with. Let's see. In fact, but he hopes for it. I mean, there's almost kind of a romantic yearning for the past in Bernard. In fact, when he goes to just picking the Savage Reservation, where they still practice things. Well, they practice Christianity, but they also practice totemism. It's a hodgepodge. It's a mixture of all different sorts of religions. And he goes back to see that. He wants to go see that on the Savage Reservation, where they still give birth naturally and things like that. He's not, he wants to see something separated from his own, his own society, which he heavily dislikes. In fact, there's the story of the director's own journey to New Mexico, which kind of suggests that there was kind of a similar kind of yearning on his part. In fact, he loses himself. He's very indecorous on pages 96, for instance. He's very indecorous and showing kind of a regret as to what happened to his companion. In fact, he says it haunts him. And that makes him feel sad. In fact, he makes himself very vulnerable, which Bernard actually likes. But when on page 97, for instance, when Bernard says, "You must have had a terrible shock," because basically he goes to New Mexico with his companion, and then his companion gets lost, and they don't know what happened to her, and he left her behind. And then once Bernard says that, It says, at the sound of his voice, the director started into a guilty realization of where he was, shot a glance at Bernard, and averting his eyes, blushed darkly, looked at him again with a sudden suspicion angry on his dignity. Don't imagine, he said, that I had any indecorous relation with the girl. Nothing emotional, nothing long drawn. It was all perfectly healthy and normal. So he's very offended that he's made himself so vulnerable in front of Bernard. Not something for someone like a director to do. And despite feeling triumphant, Helmholtz sees Bernard as petty. In fact, I think the best way to see Bernard is through Helmholtz on page 99, where he says, the boasting, for example, in the outburst of an abject self-pity with which it alternated, and his deplorable habit of being bold after the event, and in full in absence of the most extraordinary presence of mind. He hated these things in Bernard. So there are things he doesn't like about Bernard, even though he can relate to him. Okay. And we'll kind of, as far as the media is concerned, before I wrap up here, I do want to draw attention to the media that I have lined up here. The link I had for Wall-E wasn't working, so if you type in Wall-E Megashare, that link will work. The only drawback to that is the sound doesn't match up with it on Megashare for whatever reason. But you can still catch on to what's going on. If you want to at this time, for Minority Report, pause this video and go watch minutes 24:20. So 24 minutes, 20 seconds into it, and then stop at 26 minutes, 50 seconds. So go ahead and take some time and pause that and go take a look at that clip. In this clip, there's a few things that draw our attention. There's a description of the precogs in this movie. There's something called pre-crime, that these individuals called precogs can envision a crime before it happens. And so those people those people that show up in their vision are arrested before they can commit the crime. However, essentially what you get there is you get people arrested for no crime at all, really, which is why you get this term pre-crime. And in the movie, you get a description of the apparatus for detecting the pre-crime, which is these precogs, these humans in this pool. But as Tom Cruise's character says, it's better not to think of them as human. And so, like, the cost of this kind of, it's a utopian aim, because what you're trying to do is prevent murder. In fact, Tom Cruise at one point in the film even states that there's been no murder for 7 years, since they implemented the program. But the cost of that is to basically, they keep these precogs nearly unconscious, and they use them as tools rather. Their whole purpose is tools rather than giving them the same rights that you might give a regular human. They're basically the product of an experiment. And then, so the dystopian part also is people are being arrested for crimes they had not even committed. In fact, if you go take a look at minute 29 and seconds 53 through 30 minutes 30 seconds, you get to see, so if you take a moment and pause this, that might be useful. You get to see the extent of how many are imprisoned and how it has a dystopian tint to it. That so many are arrested and they haven't even committed crimes, which, in our justice system would be problematic. In fact, there's a big ethical question there as to, like, is it worth, to prevent so many murders and things like that, to put people in prison for things they haven't done. Also, next, so pause this video. Well, first go to minute 44 seconds 20 and stop at 45 minutes 15. So pause this video and then come back. In this section, one of the things that's Americans especially are particularly fearful is the extent of how much access advertisers have. And here I think you see that played out, is that just looking at your eyes, they can try to they address you directly. They try to find things that you like. Not too different from what things like Facebook and other technological capabilities do today. is that they try to find your preferences so they know how to advertise for you. And here it's, it's almost creepily so, is that you're being monitored like wherever you go. In fact, eventually this character will change out his eyes, have an operation to get his eyes changed out so he's not identified. So next, go to minute 55 and stop at minute 59. So go ahead and pause this video and then come back. What's detailed here is the history of the precogs, and you kind of see what the cost is, and it's very horrific. It seems like only 3 survived out of multiple, and so to develop this, the cost of developing this technology seems too great, ethically speaking, or the fact that it's implied that there are flaws in the precog system because the precogs are said to not always agree, which means that there's a chance that these murders that they see them committing may not have been committed even if they were allowed. It kind of suggests that there are chances that these people are innocent in general. Like if you have conflicting narratives, that's one of the things that happens. And that's basically all I wanted to talk about with Minority Report. The final thing I want to talk about is the film Wall-E. And as I said, for Wall-E, try Megashare if the other link is not working, so do a Google search for that. Okay, so the first thing I would like you to take a look at is minute 5 through 6. So pause this video, go take a look at the clip 5-minute mark through the 6-minute mark, and come back. One of the things I want you to take notice in this 1 minute is the ad. Like, it's kind of, a lot of utopias and dystopias are predicated on advertising. They have to advertise themselves as being better. And obviously the earth has gone to shit at this point because it's all just trash. And you see that it offers a great way to spend your time while the earth's being cleaned up is in outer space in this vacation resort, basically. It looks great, right? It looks ideal. The technology is great and everyone looks fit, happy, and healthy. Well, go to minute 39 seconds, go to 39 minutes, 20 seconds, and then watch through minute 42 and stop at 55 seconds, so 42, 55. So pause this video and come back. Alright, there's a few things I want you to take notice of here. Because what the ad promised is, well, the things that the ads promised are there, but they're not used in the way that they were intended. In fact, everyone's fat, basically. Grandma's not using the chairs. Everybody's using the chairs. It kind of makes fun of how lazy people are, and to what extent that affects, their health and their abilities, basically. So, yeah, everyone's combining the chairs. There's 2 guys talking to each other on, chat, like a, holographic chat screen, and they're right next to each other, which it's poking fun at the fact that they could just turn to each other, but they're too lazy to even do that. Or the fact, in fact, part of laziness is accentuated by the fact that no one's in the pool. There's a whole pool there, no one's swimming. In fact, the lady who finally sees it, we have a pool? Only sees it when she is not going with the flow. And here is also just a satire of consumer culture in general, like everyone buying into the trends that they're told to buy into. Like everyone changes the blue when they say blue is the new red, and you have silly things like lunch in a cup, which almost sounds as silly as what we have today with I don't know, KFC with the 2, they have a chicken sandwich with chicken instead of buns, basically. So it's kind of ridiculous. It's supposed to be ridiculous. It's supposed to poke fun at our consumer society. That's basically all I have. You can take a look at The Daily Show. It's a brief snippet that makes a brief mention of dystopia in our own day. In fact, this was back in December that there was just a description of our Congress being dystopian, among other things. But I think that basically concludes my lecture for today. For next time, you need to read pages 107 through 145, and just to reiterate, that is through chapter 9. Okay, guys, I hope you guys stay safe. Try not to go out if, there's a lot of snow and things like that, or if you do, be safe. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'm still available through that route. And I will see you Thursday.